It began quietly, too quietly for a war defined by thunderous engines, roaring aircraft, and the relentless grind of armored steel. In early 1944, as the German war machine stretched across the European continent, something invisible yet catastrophic was happening beneath the surface. It wasn't a battlefield defeat, nor an assassination, nor a political coup. It was something far more fundamental. Germany was running out of fuel, and almost no ordinary citizen realized it. The Reich's greatest weapon, the thing that had shocked the world in 1939 and 1940 with its lightning speed, was starting to suffocate. And like every slow disaster, it began not with an explosion, but with a quiet break in the supply chain, a crack in the industrial system, and a miscalculation so lethal that it would spell the end of Hitler's ambitions. The truth was simple: Germany was fighting a modern, mechanized war without access to natural oil. Unlike the resource-rich United States, the colonial British Empire, or the vast Soviet Union, Germany's homeland produced almost no petroleum. The Third Reich had built its early successes on two fragile pillars: synthetic fuel created from coal through costly chemical processes, and imported oil from Romania's Ploiești fields. As long as both sources remained intact, Hitler's armies could move, his aircraft could fly, and his tanks could thunder forward. But the moment either source fell, the entire war machine would begin to choke. And in 1944, the news tightened from all directions. The Allies had learned slowly, painfully, but decisively that the key to breaking Germany's military strength wasn't necessarily killing soldiers or capturing cities, it was starving the engines. American and British strategists realized that no matter how many tanks Germany built, they were nothing but dead metal without fuel. No matter how advanced the Luftwaffe's fighters became, they were useless without the aviation fuel that kept them airborne. So in January 1944, the Allies launched what historians now call the Oil Campaign, a series of relentlessly targeted bombings designed not to terrorize civilians or flatten symbolic buildings, but to strike Germany where it was genuinely vulnerable. The early missions were experimental, cautious, and often costly. Synthetic fuel plants were heavily defended, and Ploiești had already proven itself one of the most dangerous targets in Europe. But Allied strategy shifted dramatically after the success of D-Day in June 1944. Once the Allies captured French airfields, their bombers could fly deeper into Germany with greater fuel loads, heavier bombs, and shorter turnaround times. Suddenly the synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Merseburg, Politz, Auschwitz-Monowitz, and Gelsenkirchen were within easy reach. The Luftwaffe, already struggling with losses on both the eastern and western fronts, simply could not stop the incoming raids. It wasn't just bombers dropping tons of explosives, it was precision attacks on refinery cooling systems, gasification chambers, hydrogenation towers, storage tanks, and rail lines. Every component of Germany's fuel infrastructure became a bullseye. By mid-July, the results were undeniable. Fireballs rose from synthetic plants that had once supplied millions of gallons of fuel each month. The steady hum of chemical processing stopped. The pipelines that fed the Wehrmacht ran dry. And the comforting illusion that Germany could fight indefinitely evaporated overnight. Hidden inside official reports, far from the public eye, panic began spreading among German generals. Intercepted memos spoke of catastrophic reductions. Production charts plummeted. Luftwaffe commanders begged for fuel to train new pilots, only to be told that beginner flight training would be cut by 90%. Tank divisions discovered that operational movements were restricted to only the most essential maneuvers. Long-range patrols were cancelled. Even senior Nazi officials were given strict fuel rations. Meanwhile, a second disaster was unfolding: the loss of Romania. By the summer of 1944, the Red Army had swept through Eastern Europe, smashing German positions and pushing toward the Balkans. In August, Romania switched sides and joined the Allies, handing over the Ploiești oil fields, the lifeblood of the German war machine. It was as if someone had unplugged a giant power cable. One of Germany's last major sources of natural petroleum disappeared in a single political shift. The effect was immediate and brutal. Luftwaffe aircraft sat motionless on runways. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were still deadly machines, but without aviation fuel they were nothing but silent aluminum frames. Hitler's prized jet fighter, the Me-262, which he believed could reverse the entire war, was grounded for long stretches because the synthetic fuel required for its engines was no longer available. Even Hitler's motorcade, once a symbol of unstoppable authority, received priority fuel at the cost of local military units that desperately needed it. On the front lines, the crisis felt even more surreal. German tank crews received orders to abandon perfectly functional panzers because their fuel had run out. Soldiers watched helplessly as valuable vehicles were destroyed by their own side to prevent Allied capture. Logistics officers wrote increasingly grim reports: trucks stalled on supply roads, artillery tractors without fuel, and supply chains collapsing as every movement became a gamble. By September, Germany's once fearsome mobility had evaporated. The armies that had crushed Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union through rapid blitzkrieg attacks were now fighting on foot, using horse-drawn wagons, and rationing every drop of fuel as if it were liquid gold. In a war that depended on speed, Germany had become slow. In a war that required flexibility, Germany had become stiff. And in a war that demanded industrial strength, Germany had become paralyzed. Inside Hitler's headquarters, frustration boiled. Generals warned that without fuel, no counteroffensive was possible. Hitler ignored them, clinging to fantasies of miracle weapons and last-minute victories. But reality was merciless. Without fuel, even miracles couldn't fly. By the end of 1944, the once unstoppable German war machine was reduced to a shadow: silent engines, grounded aircraft, immobile tanks, and frustrated soldiers left to fight a modern war with outdated means. The fuel empire that sustained Hitler's dreams had collapsed. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with dozens of small, precise strikes that slowly starved Germany into paralysis. And the world watched as the mighty Reich began its irreversible descent, brought to its knees not by a single battle, but by the simple fact that its engines had finally run dry. Inside a crumbling giant, 1050 words. Whispers began circulating long before anyone dared speak openly: something was wrong inside the Reich. Not the kind of wrong that could be fixed by shifting troops or delivering one of Hitler's fiery speeches, but something deeper: an exhaustion inside the system itself. By early autumn of 1944, the war no longer felt like a series of battles, it felt like a clock that had begun ticking toward an unavoidable end. German officers, factory workers, civilians, and even loyal party members sensed that the nation was struggling to keep itself moving. The engines had slowed, the skies had emptied, and command rooms were filled not with confidence but with uncomfortable calculations about how to survive the approaching storm. Inside the labyrinth of Hitler's headquarters, a different kind of battle was unfolding, one made of arguments, frustration, and desperate improvisation. Reports arriving from the front spoke of stalled divisions, abandoned convoys, and soldiers marching with equipment that should have been transported by vehicles. Each report carried the same underlying message: movement had become a luxury. Generals who had built their careers on rapid armored warfare now found themselves planning defensive operations measured in meters rather than miles. Orders that once involved sweeping maneuvers now centered on holding a crossroads or a railway line simply because relocating forces required fuel that no longer existed. The shortage did more than disrupt strategy, it exposed fractures within the leadership. Field commanders accused Berlin of withholding supplies, Berlin accused regional officials of incompetence or sabotage. Hitler grew increasingly suspicious, convinced that failures were caused by disloyalty rather than scarcity. His distrust deepened when the July 20 assassination plot shook the core of the military establishment. The attempted coup, meant to save Germany from ruin, only accelerated internal paranoia. After the explosion failed to kill him, Hitler became convinced that betrayal lurked everywhere. Officers who attempted honest assessments of logistical collapse were dismissed as defeatists. Those who proposed retreats were branded traitors. The fuel crisis was no longer a logistical problem, it had become a political minefield. Meanwhile, the civilian population felt the shift in ways they had never imagined. Streets that once echoed with the rumble of military convoys grew unnervingly quiet. Public buses ran on shortened schedules. Long-distance travel became nearly impossible. Factories dedicated to producing weapons and vehicles found themselves operating in unpredictable cycles, sometimes running at full speed, other times shutting down because shipments could not arrive. Workers queued for hours not just for food but for coal and firewood. Winter approached, and with it came fears of freezing homes and unheated hospitals. Everything depended on transportation, and transportation depended on fuel. Without it, the entire domestic structure strained under its own weight. The morale of soldiers suffered worst of all. Letters home reflected growing disillusionment and a sense of abandonment. Men who once fought inside well-equipped armored battalions now walked long distances carrying heavy gear. Units that were supposed to receive resupply trucks instead relied on captured Allied vehicles that often stood useless because their engines were empty. Stories circulated of soldiers pushing trucks uphill, of tank crews guarding machines they could not start, and of artillery gunners dragging guns with exhausted horses. These humiliations, unimaginable just a year earlier, quietly drained the fighting spirit of entire formations. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, became a symbol of the nation's decline. Airfields looked deserted, not because the aircraft were gone but because they were lined up wing to wing, unable to fly. Young pilots sat around briefing rooms, listening to lectures instead of training flights. Some had never fired their weapons outside of simulations. Others had never attempted a landing on their own. Commanders pleaded for fuel to at least prepare these men for combat, but the answer was always the same: there was none to spare. When Allied bombers appeared overhead, German anti-aircraft guns fired, but few fighters rose to challenge them. Civilians who once cheered the Luftwaffe now watched bombers drift across the sky without opposition, a silent admission that air superiority had changed hands for good. As the crisis deepened, the government attempted to mask the situation through propaganda. Newspapers printed optimistic headlines about strategic regrouping. Radio broadcasts spoke of new technologies that would soon change the tide. But even the most loyal listeners recognized the contradiction between the triumphant tone and the empty streets around them. Rumors traveled faster than official statements. Some claimed secret reserves existed in Bavaria. Others believed miracle weapons were being stockpiled for a final offensive. Many simply assumed the government was withholding the truth. In a society that once prided itself on discipline and order, anxiety became the new norm. In the factories, the situation grew more dire. Engineers were instructed to modify engines to run on low-quality substitutes. Vehicles were altered to use charcoal-burning generators, which produced so little power that trucks crawled at walking speed. Workers improvised with whatever materials they had, creating machines that looked functional but performed miserably. Every adaptation was a reminder that the Reich wasn't innovating, it was improvising its way through a crisis it could no longer control. Rail transport, once a reliable backbone of German logistics, also began to fail. Allied air attacks destroyed bridges and rail yards, forcing trains to take long detours. Locomotives sat cold because coal deliveries were delayed. Freight cars piled up at junctions, loaded with weapons that could not reach the front. In some cases, trains carrying food for civilians were redirected to military units, sparking quiet resentment in towns where shelves were already bare. Hunger, something Germany had avoided for most of the war, slowly returned as an uninvited guest. The political leadership responded with increasingly harsh measures. Civilians were ordered to surrender bicycles, cars, and even farming vehicles unless they had essential permits. Farmers complained that crops spoiled because tractors couldn't run. Resistance movements inside occupied territories saw an opportunity and intensified sabotage, further choking the remaining supply lines. Police executed anyone suspected of hoarding or black market trading, yet the black market only expanded because the official system could no longer meet basic needs. Through all of this, a strange silence settled over the nation, a silence made not of peace but of exhaustion. The roar of engines that once symbolized Nazi power had faded into distant memory. Streets that once shook beneath convoys now echoed with the clip-clop of horses. Civilians walked, soldiers trudged, and commanders stared at maps that no longer reflected reality. Germany had become a giant with frozen limbs, unable to move, unable to strike, unable to defend itself the way it once could. By the close of 1944, even those who had never doubted victory could no longer ignore the truth. The war was still raging at the front, but inside Germany the collapse had already begun. The machinery that powered the Reich had slowed to a crawl, and every passing week tightened the grip of paralysis. The crisis was no longer just about fuel. It had become a mirror reflecting the fragility of a system that had once believed itself invincible. The front lines grind to a halt, 1050 words. The front lines, once a place of terrifying speed and unrelenting momentum, had become a theater of frustration and stagnation. For months, German troops had fought in a style that had made them feared across Europe, armored spearheads tearing through infantry, rapid flanking maneuvers, and a mechanized rhythm that left their enemies scrambling. By 1944, however, that rhythm was no more. Vehicles idled, tanks sat silent, and trucks that had once carried artillery and ammunition now lined roads like rusting monuments. Across the eastern and western fronts, the effect of the fuel shortage was no longer subtle, it was catastrophic, and every Allied commander could see it unfolding in real time. The Allies, who had long studied German logistics, quickly adapted to this weakness. Reconnaissance flights reported stalled armored divisions, and aerial photography revealed abandoned supply depots, stranded trucks, and tanks left in open fields. This intelligence allowed the Allies to coordinate offensives with surgical precision. They didn't need to engage the full might of the Wehrmacht head-on, they simply needed to strike where Germany could not reinforce, resupply, or maneuver. Roads that had once been arteries of blitzkrieg now became traps where immobilized units were easy targets. Soldiers, once the spear points of German conquest, were stranded behind immobile steel, watching as Allied forces gained ground with almost no resistance. The Battle of the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge, illustrated the full impact of the fuel crisis on operational planning. German forces had meticulously assembled one of their last major offensives, attempting to pierce the Allied lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. Tanks and mechanized units moved into position, but as the offensive began, fuel shortages crippled their advance. Some units had to abandon vehicles mid-operation, leaving crews to continue on foot or with limited transport. The legendary Panther and Tiger tanks, capable of dominating any battlefield, were immobilized by a scarcity of diesel. What could have been a lightning strike devolved into a grinding push, and by the time Allied reinforcements arrived, the German offensive had lost its momentum. Victory was impossible, not because of bravery or tactics, but because the engines that powered the war simply could not move. In the east, the Wehrmacht faced similar paralysis. Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, and German units that might have countered them were pinned down by their own logistical failures. Fuel trucks meant to move artillery to defensive positions never arrived. Supply columns intended to deliver food, ammunition, and replacement parts were stuck in mud or abandoned due to mechanical failure. Units that had been trained for rapid deployment could no longer respond to shifting battle conditions, turning what had been a coordinated army into a patchwork of isolated garrisons. For every kilometer the Red Army advanced, German forces lost cohesion, morale, and hope. The Luftwaffe, too, suffered far beyond the training grounds. Fighter wings had been grounded or restricted to defensive sorties, leaving Allied bombers almost unchallenged. Precision raids on synthetic fuel plants, combined with the ongoing Allied campaign, meant that any German aircraft that did take off risked running out of fuel mid-mission. Pilots knew that an extended sortie could be a one-way journey, not because of enemy fire but because of the Reich's inability to supply its machines. Even elite squadrons, flying high-performance jets like the Me-262, found themselves returning early or refusing to fly altogether. The sky, once dominated by German wings, belonged increasingly to the Allies. As the battlefield stagnated, improvisation became the norm. Soldiers pushed trucks by hand, towed